distinct. And we are, by the way, we're going to be recording at this point, letting you know. Uh, it's my distinct pleasure and honor to be able to introduce my friend, Dr. Dan Nataf. Um, Dan is uh, he's been a every 2 years after there's an election, the November meeting is hearing from Dan about what the heck happened. And we'll see what we get this time, but it's always been really thoroughly informative, great detail, and really helpful. Um, Dan is the director of the Center for the Study of Local Issues at Anne Arundel Community College, where they do lots and lots of polling, surveying, checking out how the public feels about things, and really provide an amazing service to uh, not just to Anne Arundel County and the college, but to the entire state. Uh, without further ado, let's welcome Dan Nataf. And Dan, you're muted.
Got it. There it goes. Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I just have to say that there is a great deal of interest, curiosity about understanding the last election that we went through. And, speaking to Democrats about it isn't the cheeriest thing I do. But I think that it's time for a sort of reflection about the Democratic Party and its future, and how I'd say the Democratic Party has gotten to be the way it is with the voters that it has, and so forth. So what I've done in that light is basically created a PowerPoint, which I'll share with you in a moment, which tries to identify long-term trends that are meant to explain sort of the restructuring of society, and how that is set it up in such a way that we have the kinds of voting blocks that we do, the kinds of coalitions that we've seen, the kinds of issue polarizations that we've noted. And so that sort of sets up the framework of what I'm going to talk about. And then as a secondary element, I'll be talking about things that are basically associated with the Biden administration, last 4 years. And then, we kind of accelerate through and we get to the actual campaign itself and try to see how these layers of events, processes, and really elements of causality combine themselves to produce elections of the type we've just experienced. So let me start then with the PowerPoint. Where are you, PowerPoint? Okay, I'm there, and I need to. Ah, um, Let me put this in. I think I have to go around. Hold on one second. Bear with me. Uh,
HD.
okay, for the current slide. And there we go. All right, so there's my happy information in case you want to reach me. I do it through Bill, but I do have my own email, which oddly enough I didn't put here, but it is DDNATAF. That's my last name with two D's, Daniel David, at aacc.edu. And you're welcome to send me any emails, thoughts, criticisms, comments, whatever, because I'm always trying to understand, the world in a more, complex and meaningful way. This will be the third iteration of what happened, and it has changed some since the first time I did this. And I have another one on December 9th, where it's a local kind of event with Paris Glendenning and former state senator Joe Weingrad, and I suppose a coterie of others. They're going to be there as well. And hopefully, from feedback that I get from you, I'll be able to, give it more thought and maybe pull more elements together. All right. So the first place it seems to me useful to start is with the results. And this is what I pulled together today in terms of the percentage of the vote. That this is presidential votes, so since 2012 through 2024. And you can see that every prior election, Democrats got a majority of the electorate, even if they weren't always able to win, which was obviously the case in 2016. This time was the first time in a long time where Democrats lost the popular vote. And, that phenomena has led to a lot of, gnashing of teeth as to, what segments of the electorate were lost and so forth. And I think that it's worth thinking about that. But, if you kind of look at it long term, 51% is like the most you get. 48% is the least you get. So you've got it. There's a pattern here of a 3-point variation, right? And the same thing essentially is true when you include the recent Trump success. There's a 3-point variation on the Republican side. The What is a little different this time is that Trump was able to get a larger share of the electorate than was the Democrat, and that is obviously the phenomena that it causes us some thought. But again, if you look at it carefully and you say to yourself, what actually happened? Did Trump get more votes than he had in 2020? Yes, he did. He got 2.5 million more votes. But the real focus is here, right? There are 7 million Democrat or people who voted for Biden. I don't know who they were, right? That stayed home and did not vote this time. And so the mystery that needs to be unraveled, and which is hard to do, right? I mean, it's hard. How do you can't do an exit poll to people who don't vote, right? And so it's a challenge for us to try to figure out why these people were demoralized or lacked incentive, whatever the case might have been, to say to ourselves, 7 million people who just disappeared. Um, that is the enigma that needs to be understood. Because you look back at Biden's number, this was a giant number, right? It was an unprecedented number and must have brought in a whole lot of people who were then disgruntled with Trump, even though the Trump number was 12 million, or not quite, but around 12 million more than it had been just 4 years before. So this was like a record-breaking turnout. And this time it was even more record-breaking for Trump, but not for Harris. All right, let's look a little bit, and this will go back in an iterative way, and so we'll talk about what I just mentioned, in different ways, at different points in the presentation. Wait, back. What I want to do next is to look a little bit at the Electoral College map. Our challenge as Americans is living with the decisions of the founders, right? This is as true with the Second Amendment as it is with lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court, as it is with deciding to move on this Electoral College model. And so if you look at 2012, which was obviously a good year, 51 million or 51% obtained by Obama over Romney, you kind of say this was kind of a best case scenario in many respects. This was back in the good old days where states like Ohio, uh, Iowa, Florida were still in the blue camp, right? And in just 2 years, 4 years, sorry, uh, Ohio disappears, Florida disappears, Iowa is no one even thinks of it as a competitive state, and except for Ann Seltzer, whose poll was crazy. The Iowa poll will never lived down that day when she predicted that Harris had a 3-point advantage, right? All right, so this seems to be a time when things sort of fell apart from an electoral college point of view, and that blue wall just wasn't there. Plus, you lost Ohio, and so you again put Iowa and Florida. So 2020 then tells us something of how things, what is changing in the electoral college map. Well, one thing that happened is that Arizona was a pickup, right? Uh, and so that was interesting and impressive. You got one out of Nebraska, which you hadn't gotten before. Yeah, that's kind of impressive. But most important, it was Georgia, right? 16 electoral college votes from Georgia was really a giant thing. And this is why Trump kept on trying to say, find those 11,900 votes. They must be there somewhere. No Republican loses Georgia, right? Well, okay. But the blue wall held that year. You didn't capture Ohio. That seemingly was out of the picture, for at least for the moment. And again, Iowa is same. So what do you get this year? Well, what you get is basically the Clinton map, right? Um, except that she won Nevada and Harris did not. Harris did not win Arizona. She did not win Georgia. She did not win the three blue wall states, to say nothing of Ohio or Iowa, right? Um, North Carolina had been won at one point by Obama, as you know, Florida had, but then North Carolina was won by uh, for governor and I believe for attorney general. And so Democrats did win there, but could not win for president, and thus couldn't. There was nowhere to compensate for the blue wall losses, right? And here, this is another way of visualizing uh, what states were doing what, right? So essentially, the super blue states included Maryland, in Vermont. Vermont had a 31 and a half point gap between Harris and Trump, even though they elect a Republican governor. Go figure that one. And Maryland had the second highest gap at 27.4%. That was greater than California, which was at 21%. And you can kind of see the coast is comfortably not likely to change at any time soon. But you can see these rather upsetting losses in Nevada and Arizona, areas that are swing states out west. Georgia was lost by very little, and the same was true in North Carolina, very small margins. And so, whatever you want to say about the changing demographics and the coalition you're putting together and so forth, if you look at these states, right, these two southern states, and then you look at Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, right, those three together, somebody totaled, and I heard said that if those three were separated by 178,000 votes, that's the number of votes that you'd have to have flipped in order to have won the blue wall. Right? And who knows how many you would have to flip in Georgia? Probably not a lot as well. So, so the election was competitive. It just was systematically less. Those 7 million people that preferred the couch are if you want to think of them, they are the culprits. They are the reason why we don't have a Harris administration and we do have a Trump administration, because so much of the rest of this is just baked in. And there's just, other than occasional pickups in South and the West and, the kind of best possible scenario, but the margins here were so small. And that's where the pickups kind of look the most tempting. If you all have any comments or thoughts, speak up, because if not, I kind of just go on. But if you do, I'm happy to listen to you. Now, the question of was the top of the ticket a drag on those running down ballot? In some ways, you have to think that that probably was true because Arizona, Gallego, Ruben Gallego won, uh, and had not a giant margin, but won anyway, a 3-point win when Harris was down by 5. And Nevada, she's down by 3, and Jackie Rosen wins, right? John Tester was 7 points higher than Kamala Harris in terms of the overall vote count. And Amy Klobuchar was 5 points higher than she was, right? And if you look through a lot of these states, right, Wisconsin, these weren't losses because the Senate candidate was more popular by a little bit, right? It's like just those people came out of the couch enough, or people voted for Trump and then didn't vote down ballot, or they split ballot, right? They voted for Trump, but liked their local Democrats who could have a not national appeal, but a localized appeal. I could speak to the issues of people in those states and do not have to then bring in all the baggage of a national campaign, right? And, sadly, it looks like Senator Casey will be former Senator Casey, even though he's down. I was looking today, I think, it's 16,000 votes with 99% counted. Right? So, yeah. Two states did worse. The senatorial candidate did worse than Harris. One of these was Maryland, right? And, Hogan was a popular governor. In my polling in Anne Arundel County, he was regularly in the 65 to 75% job approval. Sometimes more Democrats and Republicans liked him. And so that he didn't win is testimony to the kind of presidential election years and the kind of robust turnout among Democrats because there are just so many of them, and it's hard to if you can't make inroads in Baltimore County as a Republican, you're going to lose, right? Because it's just impossible to overcome the margins that Democrats get in Baltimore City, Prince George's, and Montgomery County. And so, he didn't do well enough in just Eastern Shore and Western Maryland, Anne Arundel County, some places he just didn't do well enough. But he did much better than expected just by looking at the Trump vote. And the same thing was true about Utah, but I don't know anything about Utah, so I won't make any comments on that. I will also say that Mr. Osborne did, surprisingly well at running as an independent in Nebraska, right? And so there was a possibility. Again, it seems like in some states, running as a Democrat isn't going to take you far. Running as an independent might lead to a closer than expected race. If you go up to Maine, right, you see that I added up Angus King's total along with the Democratic. They had a Democrat running for Senate. And if you put the two together, it's like King was at 52 and the Democrat was around 10. And so this was 10 points plus higher than Harris's vote total. And so again, it's if there's a lesson, it's again localizing the candidate and sort of distinguishing them from kind of national democratic politics. As much as that may seem like an upsetting thought, there are just some states where Democrats running as Democrats are going to have maybe an impossibly hard task. If you ever saw some of Tester's ads, I don't know if you'd know that he was a Democrat running in Montana. I saw a couple of them, and they were pretty hard hitting, and they were very localized, which is, again, why he came as close as he did. He was somebody, again, had run many times and was well known. All right. When we look overall in recent Senate outcomes from 2020, 22, and 24, I just gave the race in Pennsylvania. The Republicans made it 53-47. It's it's the first time in recent history that they've had an actual majority. And the question I ask about the Republican senators in particular, are they going to perceive Trump as a lame duck, and thus not be so eager to follow his absolute disruption, maximum pressure model of governance, if they believe that at some point he's going to be irrelevant. Now, you might say, well, what about Vance, or what about the MAGA wing in general and so forth? And that's true. How disruptive avoiding they can become is not clear, but it seems like they persuaded Matt Gaetz that he would not get through. And to the extent that that shows some smidgen of independence from Trump, again, we'll have to see how sustained that is. Also in the election of Toone rather than Rick Scott for the majority leader in the Senate. And so, I haven't completely given up hope that there will be some semblance of check among Republicans. We'll just have to see if the Senate, kind of just goes along or if it doesn't. In the House, I again looked up the results just today, and that's what it is. It's virtually an exact replay of 22. So 22, everybody said, wow, Democrats did better than expected because it was a midterm election. They increased their hold in the Senate, and they lost basically 10 seats in the House, which, the House has got obviously many more seats. And yes, there's more at play, right? Maybe there's, I don't know, 40-ish competitive seats out of 435. And so, they could flip back and forth. You can kind of see the early flipping. So here we're at around, 47 or so. Here we're at 36. And then, so we're again looking at what is the potential of flippable seats, and it's in the 40-ish range, right? Good days one way, good day, bad day the other way. And you're not going to top that number unless some strange drama happens. So let me turn then to how did we get here? And here I'll kind of go through this quickly. It might be a familiar story, and if so, just hold on. We'll get to more recent times. But I think the long term starts and you can start it anywhere you wanted, Vietnam and Watergate, JFK. You can start it anywhere, but I try to start it in the 1980s because that was at that time where the economic model was being contested in the sense that slowly emerged a generalized consensus about kind of neoliberal economic posture, which emphasized small government, low taxes, low regulation, and free trade, capital mobility. All these things were like market in a Smith Ricardo-ish kind of way. And the odd thing about it is that it did produce growth. And it would be unfair to characterize a movement to that model as being simply an effort, I don't know, to crush traditional democratic positions or something. There had reached, you remember, the 70s were a period of stagflation, and something had to give, right? It was you could argue as to what should have replaced the model that had prevailed until then, but this was the model. And its long-term characteristic was to separate society ever more into winners and losers, even though there was growth, right? And so the GDP per capita was growing, and unemployment was going lower, and so forth. But my general take on this is that over time, the traditional industries, right, the manufacturing sector, in Western countries in general, and in the United States not excluded, was increasingly subject to low-cost labor competition, especially from abroad. Moreover, companies could say to organize to labor as a group, if your demands are excessive, we can just go somewhere else. And there are low-cost countries all over the place, which are maybe they prohibit unions, maybe they don't have safeguards for workers and so forth. And so we can just go there. All right. Layered onto that was a push for automation, also to try to reduce the labor component in production. And increasingly, these things together, this kind of free trade model coupled with automation, undermined the ability for unions to effectively keep the share of the labor of the working class organized. In the 50s, it was around 35%. It's dissipated now to it's well under 10%. And so, again, why is that? Because the neoliberal model ensured that the working class would be displaced, right? And the beneficiaries of the system were mostly in the white collar, the upper white collar professions, tech industries. People as consumers would get low cost imported goods. And that was the bribe, right? Don't worry about the job losses and all that, because you can always go to Walmart. And so, yeah. And during this period, what we saw is a growth of income inequality. Again, if you play around with the Gini coefficient and look at it from this period on, it kept on getting to be a larger value, and the larger the value, the greater the inequality. It was true during the Clinton years. It kept on going. And so the winners and losers started increasingly looking like the college education divide. Aside from the very rich getting richer, education, instead of muscle and brawn, became the ticket to success in the kind of post-industrial economy. And what accompanied that was an increasing embrace of Democrats of this higher educated group, right? And I'll show you a little bit later a graph about perceptions of how well the Democrats represent the working class. But as the Democrats started representing the winners, they started representing the values and interests, the struggles and concerns of those winners. Many times those were cultural values. They kind of, if you've ever read the Ronald Inglehart series on postmodernism and the idea that at one point the push for modernization pushed people towards economic security, but kind of like some kind of complex Maslowian hierarchy. As you got wealthier and more secure, you started thinking more in terms of self-actualization and realizing your identities, your whims, your thoughts, and so forth. You were no longer obsessed with the kind of basic economic stability issues, right? And along with this, the gender divide kind of got bigger because, again, when you're moving away from brawn to brain, why not? This is an area where women can compete very well, and increasingly you saw at law schools and medical schools, the shift from being male dominated to being more equal, and then increasingly more women than men were getting college degrees, getting higher degrees, and so forth. And so this plays out in the 90s with a kind of erosion of like a traditional identities and more like on race and like on ethnicity, these non-class identities, they're concentrated as elements of the Democratic Party as part of the they call it kind of an elite coastal, all this stuff, but the mindset that seems detached from what remains of the working class. And it also overlaid with geographic sorting. So increasingly, people in rural areas were very sharply impacted by deindustrialization. I actually read a book called The Rural Voter, where they lay this out in detail. There were just a whole um, uh, multitude of jobs that were just lost with deindustrialization. So China didn't just affect Detroit; it affected all of not the urban areas of America. Um, and so this opened then the door to a kind of cultural nationalist and populist working class reflux, right? Those that group of people who were perceiving themselves as losers within neoliberalism were open to a new appeal. On top of that, we have a situation where America's place in the world was also being questioned. And so, with the end of the Cold War, um, the fear of communism among the kind of ruling class and elite dissipated. There was no counter model to worry about anymore, so you didn't really have to be very nice to the working class, and you could just focus on other things. Um, and after 9/11, one of the things that tore apart, I would say, the Republican Party, and we think of it as tore apart the Democrats, but in hindsight, it tore apart the Republican Party, is the propensity of kind of neocons to steer America into endless wars in the Middle East. And this idea that America could be the global leader, the hegemon, right? That this model, that too started shrinking, particularly on the right, because they were becoming more nationalist, more self-concerned, right? They just didn't, what's it to us that Europe is, got Putin invading, the Ukraine? Why is that our problem? Was it our problem? Afghanistan was our problem. Iraq, was it Syria? You go down the list of why are those things our problem? Well, because we were the hegemon post-war, and that just immediate reflux was not as easily sold as it had been in the past. And so Trump would make good sense out of this. He would talk about the burden sharing inequities between other NATO members and the United States. He would say, why are they paying so little? And they've got these marvelous welfare states, and we're subsidizing them. And that money could go and subsidize us. And again, that sounds kind of tempting. It's a zero-sum model of the world, right? And if what you're not getting is what they're getting, you say, well, bring it back home. And I'd say the immigration issue overlays into this because on the one hand, if you're moving more in a nationalist, traditionalist way, white Christian nationalists, these things like overlay in all sorts of ways. And to immigration seems like another moment when America becomes the savior of the world. And we're beyond that, right? That is the mindset that now prevails, or that you can see it was in the process of becoming, it was getting to be more prevalent. And it became common in the Republican camp to see immigration as a problem, a dissipation of a concept of Americanism, as well as a dissipation, particularly in the southern border and the kind of the invasions and waves and everything that Trump used to talk about, first term. That just seems as a decline in law and order and an ineffective government. Right? The government isn't protecting the border, period. Right? And so that is something that had to be dealt with. And so what we then see is that by 2016, Trump has taken over the Republican Party. And by 2024, the old guard is just gone, right? The neoliberals, as well as the neocons, are gone. They are not given any role within the nominating convention. And there is a consolidation of the model, this kind of, post-hegemony model at that time. Democrats aren't sure where they want to be, right? And so Bernie Sanders is kind of the left-wing version of Trump, but he's obviously not xenophobic. He's not, so wedded. He's not wedded to a nationalist uh, and sort of white supremacist Christian nationalist kind of that whole thing. That's not Bernie Sanders at all. But the idea of refocusing on the working class, that I think is a common area. With Clinton and Obama, they're really the residues of neoliberalism, right? They speak to that, and I would say so does Biden. And so that brings us up to the short term, where we are trying to look at, how has this evolution then left us where we are now? And so there are a lot of reasons, you might say, for why Biden Harris didn't win. I think among the many possible reasons, and I'll give you a rationale a little bit. I mean, many rationales for this as we go through, but the incumbent handicap this time was severe. I found this person who had done some research and said this is the first time since 1905 that incumbent parties in every single liberal democracy in the world lost share in elections, right? And if you look through in France and in Germany and other places where they had election, and now Germany's going to have another election. Let's see what Alliance for Germany does, and a far right party. But everywhere there's been an election, the incumbent party has lost. Right, it's lost share. It might not have lost governance, but it loses share and now has to redo the governing coalition, all that. Right. So my sense is that regardless of all the other stuff I've just mentioned, the this election was going to be a difficult election no matter what. And so, even with perfect governance, it would have been challenged. And there are other things that during the Biden years we saw that we know were not good. One was the rate of inflation. The cumulative inflation under Biden was 20%. Under Trump, it had been 7%. Wages did not keep up with that 20%. It did in those 3 years, right, of Trump. They don't count the fourth year, right? 2020 is kind of put out of memory and is never thought of as an issue. It's a little shocking, but there you have it. Moreover, just what COVID did to society was terribly polarizing in itself, because it did force the incumbent party to take actions that many people saw as unpopular. And so business shutdowns, school shutdowns, all sorts of restrictions on, social distancing, masking, you name it, vaccinations. I'd never seen a demonstration about medical tyranny till COVID, right? But there it was. And governments tried to react as best they could. They passed major stimulus programs and income support programs. You probably don't remember very vividly American Rescue Plan, but that was a nearly $2 trillion infusion into the American economy at a point when there were all these supply chains and constraints on production, manufacturing, and all that. Well, that, according to this guy, Michael Strain, you can look him up at American Enterprise Institute. I know that's a culprit organization, but Jason Furman argues exactly the same thing, who was an economic advisor to Obama. This contributed some points to inflation, right? It could be anywhere from 1 to 4 points. But when you say to yourself, If 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 the if it had been only $1 trillion and you had brought it down by 1.5 or 2 points, maybe, inflation cumulatively would have been 12 or 13%. The price of egg dynamic might not have been quite as bad. And, you needed 178,000 votes. Could you have gotten it with a little less ambitious inflation plan, or I'm sorry, a income support plan? Hindsight is 2020, but a lot of people were saying it's too big. Economists were saying it's too big. Democrats did not listen. They went their own way. All right. And I would say that the Fed was no better. You remember Larry Summers was yelling, his ears were on fire. Smoke was coming out of his ears, I should say, saying this is not a transitory, supply chain only thing. It's more fundamental. And he was ignored. It resulted in a slow process of acknowledging inflation, resulting in a very quick raising of interest rates, which then had a kind of traumatic impact over the economy overall in terms of making housing, cars unaffordable. Here I am just showing you, this is based on polling in Anne Arundel County, but it's symbolic of the general problem. All right, here's the beginning of the COVID. The first time we polled after COVID was in fall of 2020. And as we did, this was what's happening to the right direction for the country. Right? It was just catastrophically declining. And that, again, this would have happened no matter who was in power, but it just shows that it was very hard to come up with a winning formula. And this was the same, right? This is Larry Hogan was still governor. This is the state, right? This is where, state, everybody's really happy about it and so forth. And it drops 20 points. When Hogan doesn't get unelected until fall of 22, right? And it drops a little bit further, when Wes Moore is elected because Republicans no longer like it. As I told you, Democrats were pretty happy with Larry Hogan. But in any case, that just reinforces the idea that COVID is the incumbent handicap. Now, when you think about how do people what do they do when they're voting? What are they thinking? They're thinking about what policies you passed and how well you executed on the policies, right? And those are distinguishable concerns. So on foreign policy, people wanted to get out of Afghanistan. So the policy of getting out was not the problem. The performance was the problem, right? How you got out was the problem. It was truly a visual mess of people, just trying to hold on to landing gear of planes, leaving desperately from the Kabul airport in the face of the absolute collapse of the friendly government to us and the Taliban's victory. Again, I don't know who Biden was relying on for intelligence and advice, but I think Trump has a point in saying no one lost their job. That doesn't make any sense. Somebody needed to go back to intelligence school. The economic policies, I already mentioned it. Immigration. The immigration was an issue that the Biden administration it was torn, right? On the one hand, it understood that it was an issue that had to be confronted. On the other hand, they were eager to do something not Trump. And so this led to a kind of on and off, hot and cold mixture of policies, and ultimately led to the attempt to shore up the southern border through a bill that was negotiated with some Senate Republicans, and as Harris always would indicate, it was derailed by Trump. But this was very late in coming, and even after the failure of that bill, they passed through executive orders a whole set of changes in procedures at the border that did a lot to reduce the flow of immigrants. You remember when Harris was debating with Trump, the moderator asked her, "You've done a lot of series of measures at the border meant to curb immigration. That's been successful. Why couldn't you do that 3 years ago?" I don't know if you remember what she said, but in my mind, I'll never forget it. She went back on the "we had a deal, Senate deal, blah, blah, blah." And then she went on and said, "But Trump's rallies are poorly attended. People fall asleep." She never once responded to the question that was asked. Right? And because there was no good answer. But that didn't make, that's so it was a message that wasn't great because the policy wasn't great. It was policy performance that failed. And so when you try to say, why didn't the Democrats win? You look at policy. What policies just were not good policies, and people punished you. They remembered it, and they punished you for it. And the odd thing also is that the infrastructure bill was a bipartisan bill, and Biden didn't get much credit for it. The Inflation Reduction Act was not a bipartisan bill and focused on a climate change agenda, which is itself highly divisive, because that looks again like the educated elite that wants electric everything, and the fossil fuel workers who are laying pipes and drilling here and there or building internal combustion engine cars. They don't see their future in that. And so it divides the working class from the college educated non-brawn guys, and you reap what you sow. All right. When we look at the candidate and sort of the process of selecting the candidate, you'll see that in my next slide that Biden's job approval stayed low. It wasn't always low, but it slipped considerably, and it was warning signs that things were not going well. And so in hindsight, we would all probably agree it would have been nice if Joe Biden had said to everybody, "I am a one-term president. I am a transitional figure. I want a new generation of leadership, and we should have an open primary to decide, where we are as a party, and not necessarily just to hand the baton to his vice president, who was then part of all that people didn't like about the incumbent regime, right? Again, if the incumbent regime if Biden had been at 53% in job approval and he said, "I'm an old guy, I don't want to run again, but my vice president, who's only 60, does want to run," well, I'd applaud and say that's the greatest choice ever. Let's go with her. But here's a change election, and you're putting your VP up as the anointed one with no consideration of anyone else. And so there's no, and this then made it impossible for Harris to campaign effectively, because she couldn't be the anti-Biden group. I mean, even friendly, within the friendly camp, but still, she couldn't say what she would have done differently. She tried to at the View, right? And she said, "Here are so many wonderful things we've done." That's as if she was, that they were way up ahead, right? And polls and everywhere else. Yes, you'd say, "We're going to drill down and do more of the same because you like it so much." But, this was a change election. She had to say, on immigration, we screwed up. We might have just done too much on that inflation thing. She had to do some kind of a mea culpa, but she was unable to do it. And so people stopped listening at a certain point, and then Harris herself was a lightning rod for consternation as to what were her true beliefs. This is why people kept on saying, "I'm not really sure I know her," right? Because, countless ads came out of the Republican camp about the 2019 Kamala Harris, who was vying with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders on who's in favor of Medicare for all more, right? And she answered a questionnaire by the ACLU. You surely know this, where she was asked whether she would approve having a undocumented person in prison who requested a sex change operation, whether she would go along with that. And she said, yeah. And so all you needed then to do is to play an ad where her own words come back to haunt her. You play that at at the World Series, every place you can. It's she's they them. I'm for you. It's just a setup, right? It's just these are a few wavering people. Maybe some of the couch potatoes listened to that and just said, I don't think she represents my views. We'll never know for sure, but we do know that it was easy to bill her as part of the white collar beneficiaries of globalization. Right? She was a San Francisco liberal, a woman, a black person, an Asian. I mean, all these things, and you're looking at those swing states, and you're saying to yourself, that might not be an easy sell. Right? And we can even talk about Tim Walz versus Josh Shapiro is another element in all this. Here are the job approvals. Now you look at the Biden side. The difference between Biden and Trump is Biden starts much higher, right? There is a honeymoon period. There really isn't for Trump. He starts at around 45. Biden is at 55. That's where you want to be during the honeymoon period. And yet he doesn't stay there. By September of 21, he's at 42%. He's lost 10, 12 points, which, by the end of his term, he never regains. He got a momentary little fluff moment, right? And who knows what contributed to that. But you can see that the midterms came kind of on an upswing. And so, times weren't quite as bad. If Democrats had lost the midterms more profoundly than they did, this would have motivated Biden to say to himself, well, my job approval is not good. Democrats didn't do well. This is a change election. I need to move out of the way. But that didn't happen. And there you have it. With Trump, as I say, he starts low and ends low, which is why Biden was able to defeat him as handily as he did. And for whatever reason, people have collective amnesia about this period, right? They just don't remember why this guy was a 35% or a 37% or consistently a 39%. Right? It seems like the Trump years were cheap eggs. It's about all you can remember about it. You don't remember anything else, the chaos, the COVID, and all that. You just don't remember. When you're looking in July, right, of this year, and you're looking at issues and assessing, where are we in the race? Okay. On foreign policies, Trump's up 10. On economic policy, Trump's up 13. On immigration policy, he's up 17. Right? Even on Supreme Court nominations, he's even. So what's Biden winning in? Abortion by 4 points, and works well with others. He's not a disruptor, 8 points. All right. The telltale is this. The Pew research showed Trump's lead over Biden was 50% versus 47. And, I just sit there and say to myself, where did we end up? We ended up at 48, 49 and a half. In other words, the election was baked in back then. Harris may have gotten a point or two higher, but Trump essentially was baked in July with Joe Biden as the candidate. I think Joe Biden as the candidate hurt himself in the debate, right? And that led to the absolute shambolic and delegitimating process by which Democrats came up with another candidate, which, might well have been another couch potato incentive. That process seems like the party is just out of control, doesn't know what it's doing. It can't stand up to Joe, and hasn't established a process to find anybody else. And so, we're just praying that everybody's happy enough. The theory of the great relief, right? Joe Biden isn't there. Oh gosh. And then again, if you look at where the most of the persuadable voters were, They were here. They were on immigration and the economy. The economy was the top issue among Democrats and Trump supporters. It was the top issue all the way around. The problem is Harris just didn't have much to say about it. She never mea culpa, didn't promise change. She had opportunity economy and kind of, Oprah style, you get at this, you get at that. I'm going to give you something, your small business, first time home buyer, child, you get, everybody gets something. But the problem was just profoundly a retrospective looking back at price levels in general. It wasn't government solving it for targeted groups. It was the blame for the rise in prices overall. And again, it's a change election. You kind of needed new people. And let me move on. Just I know we're probably running out of time. Other elements of the campaign. I think that Trump's appeal, Democrats could never really grasp that Trump would have any appeal because they saw him as so thoroughly loathsome, vile, and odious that it just, all you needed to do was sort of step in and say, I'm not Trump, and you would win by default, right? And so you layer that on with fears about the end of democracy and, the felon and all this. The problem is that wasn't the swing voters were just not interested. I mean, as much as those of us who are careful watchers of government were absolutely interested. But again, that's kind of the intellectuals of the bunch, right? The people worried about the price of eggs and kind of jobs and all that. They're not resonating. That appeal is not resonating, right? And I think the another problem, and it's not just I don't know why this was true other than the retrospective character of the vote, but it just wasn't. Harris was not able to bring enough attention to Trump's program. Maybe he was elusive about his programs, and she did talk about the tariffs and the $4,000 cost and all that, but it just didn't seem to take. People were it was retrospective voting, not prospective voting. And so you couldn't just sit there and campaign, point for point, who's got a better approach to inflation looking into the future. I think there was also an overestimation of the role of abortion and mobilizing women. Women in many states that had abortion on the ballot voted for the abortion, to protect the pro-choice position, and they voted for Trump because you say, well, how could you do that? Well, I protected myself from on the abortion front, but I still like Trump's economy and price of eggs, right? I can get both. It's all of the above. And so that was actually, it worked. I think it backfired. Again, the endless war proposal, it's always shocking when I hear the right wing talk about endless war and how bad it is. And I was thinking, right wing is neocons. Those guys are so far out to lunch that they're never going to make a showing again. I've already talked about the cultural stance on the climate change issue. Harris flip-flopped on fracking. They ran 1,000 ads on that. And, again, you can't be who you're not, right? Here's a chart I found that said Democrats fared better with the richest Americans than the poorest Americans for the first time in decades. The poorest is this line, right? So Democratic minus Republican margin. And, the richest third is up, the poorest third is down, the middle third sort of unchanged. But that's telling you something, isn't it? And then uh, voters associate Democrats more with social cultural issues than class and economic solidarity. This is the view. The main reasons people like the Democratic Party, the kind of New Deal coalition, boom, right? And so in the 20s, this is when the after effects of neoliberalism are so thoroughly processed that the working class has simply decided the Democrats are not for them. And then again, you can see here among swing voters, the reason they didn't vote for Harris, inflation, immigrants, and culture, right? So, um, and then here I say the same thing, there was losses among Latinos, among African Americans, among youth, There were, if you look demographically as to where, or geographically, and you say where are the gains among Democrats, there are very few. Most places they were not doing as well in 2020, in 2024 as they were in 2020. And so when you get to questions, could the Harris campaign have done anything different, right? Other than try to be a change candidate, which as vice president was going to be very hard, right? But they raised a ton of money, so they didn't have that as a problem. They, picked up Biden's campaign. I don't know that there's a whole lot more that could have been done. I mean, they showed a lot of ads. There's no doubt of that. They held a lot of rallies. The get out the vote thing, the things that you guys do, right? Phone calls, door knocking, postcard writing, all that whole story. I'm going to show you in a minute what I think about, or what the public thinks about the efficacy of all that. But in any case, and then the problem of the complex media environment. Again, we can talk about that if you want, but everybody will say, well, why didn't she go to Joe Rogan and have an interview to get and talk to the young bros and all that? Maybe, I don't know if much would have changed. There's another argument that says, her core economic message was diluted by efforts to win over the Cheney and Kinzingers of the world. Again, I don't know that there was a core economic argument when Joe was the candidate. So I don't tend to believe that. All right. Here's what voters think affects them. And so when you ask a voter, how important was the following in terms of getting you to, think or about voting for whoever you voted for, they're going to tell you that they did some kind of research. And that's what they're going to tell you, and that they typically went online to do it. So that means that if you're a candidate, you better have an online media strategy that is comprehensive and well funded, and highly targeted, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because that's how people find out about you. That's how they are going to make their decisions about whether they support you, right? Things that, like receiving a postcard, most people don't think that's important, right? Most people think nothing of that. They probably have never received a postcard. Who knows? Did you receive a phone call? Most people think it's not important. An ad on the radio, an ad at any place, right? The ads on the social media, door to door. That was actually not so low. That was, I was surprised. That was actually higher than I thought. And ads on TV, they probably underestimate the effect of that, especially among older generations. And then friends or family, it's like, how do you, that's like that's part of the echo chamber people live within, right? They go around, talk to their friends and family. What are you doing? Here, what I'm just going to briefly show this. This is where the overall numbers, this is a chart that shows issue saliencies. When you ask somebody how important is this issue on a 5-point scale, and they give you the number 5, it's very important. So as I go through these different elements, you can see the kind of, this is the average. And when you look at, these are the 3 Democrats, Elford, Sarah Elford, Angela Alsobrooks, and Kamala Harris. You can see there the issue saliencies were very similar. Harris was a little lower and thus less absolutely fixed within the core Democratic constituents, right? Those who always say certain issues are the biggest thing. Like, it's no surprise that on climate change, Elford's voters were very high on that because that's who she is. She's kind of environmental, right? That's her main thing. And then when you look, just go to the other side here. If your issues are immigration or crime, Democrats are not talking to you. They're just not. They're not listening. They don't care. It's like you're just not part of the salient population. And on those issues, no difference among all 3. They are all synonymous, right? If your problem is high taxes, if your problem is inflation, right? The average is way up here. Democrats, especially Sarah's way down here, is a 20-point gap, right? Her voters just don't care about inflation. So, when you say that, you're saying, okay, they're not worried about the cost of living. They're not the working class. They're other people. Right? They're educated people who care about clean water, clean air, electrification, da da da, all that stuff. But again, that simply tells you the message that I've been saying is, the working class is dissipated. And Bernie Sanders is good for feeling rebellious about things. So, he came up with this quote. It's no great surprise that the Democrats have abandoned, which had the party, which has abandoned working class people, find the working class has abandoned them. First, it was the white working class. Now it's Latino and Black workers. The Democratic leadership defends the status quo. People are angry and want change, and they're right. All right. He's right about this election being a change election. And insofar as there's hyperbole in this, but there's also a grain of truth, right? There's a reckoning that has to come about in the Democratic Party about what are they going to do with regards to the working class? How are they going to reach out to it, not without at the same time being off-putting to the women and higher educated people and all the groups that have gravitated increasingly to the Democratic Party. So that's why I say there's a sort of soul reckoning. And so where we end on this is, what will the Democrats try to do over time? Are they going to move somewhere to the center on culture stuff and try to find candidates who don't have, things in their, skeletons in their closets about trans, undocumented workers who want a trans surgery thing? I mean, I can't imagine putting more, kind of offensive elements into one question. I mean, Ezra Klein asked, when I listen to him all the time, he said, why did the ACLU ever ask such a ridiculous question? It just put her on record in a way that it hurt her and hurt trans people and probably hurt undocumenteds as well. So there's that. Will the Democrats try to do something about America as the global leader? Biden never had any. He was wedded to the post-war consensus as America, the indispensable nation. I don't know where that's going. I think Ukraine is going to cut a deal soon and get what it can out of this. And so the focus of Democrats have to be at least what stances can we take and what candidates can we run to get through the blue wall. Unless you do that, unless you're able to pick up North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada to compensate, you're still looking at the blue wall states, right? That whole thing, the Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. You're still looking at that as your insuperable barrier. And so you just can't, you have to have a kind of tempered person. I mean, Klobuchar, she was in the presidential race and no one really thought, that much about it. I don't think she's that charismatic, but she sells really well. And so in Minnesota, okay, Minnesota is a little bit progressive and so forth, but Tammy Baldwin, I mean, there's people up there who understand what they need to say to localize the race so that their voters are not going to sit there and say, you're a San Francisco extremist. And so what will the leadership of the Democratic Party think about all this? Well, what light will they see? Some of us may be inclined to just say, well, let's forget everything I've just said, because Trump will screw up so badly that even if we do nothing, we'll get back up to 51% like Biden did, because everyone will remind themselves of what they so disliked about the first Trump years. And I say that might happen if Trump doesn't weaponize so many elements of government that he makes the election of the future seem more like Viktor Orban's elections and not like the freewheeling experience we just had. All right, guys. Well, that is my presentation. I will stop sharing and see if anybody's still here. Oh, yes, you're here. That's good. I thought for sure by this point you'd either turn me off in effigy or just said, "Dan, shut up already." But Bill, I give it back to you.
Well, thank you, Dan. Fantastic. Really, really. Um, hang on just a second. I've got to keep from getting feedback here. Um, yeah, so really fantastic, detailed, thought-provoking. Um, I don't know how much time you have for questions, uh,
I
but
can stay here all night. I got
but I
nothing else
I
in my.
expect that a fair number of people have questions, and I will perhaps turn it back to you uh, with the. Well, let me do it this way. I'll call on people who raise their hands, right? And um, Ms. Howard, you're first.
Let me take myself off mute and figure out how to lower my hand. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much for entertaining my question, and thank you so much for that presentation. I absolutely read almost all of your reports. Huge fan.
Thank you.
I just wanted to just um, issue maybe a couple comments around white supremacist language. I noticed this time that Trump actually um, slightly changed the direction of his campaign messaging to try to target um, Hispanic and African American men, especially around economics um, and the border issue. Looking at as Americans and how it affects joblessness. So I just have noticed in attending a couple of different organizations, post election discussions that the race issue continues to be, and it still may very well be a part of his campaign. But this particular time, I noticed he adjusted his messaging.
Mhm.
The second point I just wanted to make is male versus female, woman versus man. One of the issues that I saw as a possible difference in how people were voting is that I noticed that that there could have been an issue with gender, just in general, the idea of a woman being president at such a time. So
Mhm.
thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't have a lot to say about the actual language Trump used in terms of white supremacist language. I think that I it's hard to disentangle the complex web that is Donald Trump. He, he had that moment when he was asking about whether Harris was black. That's not white supremacist, but gosh, it sounds like you're raising the issue of race in a way that white supremacists might agree with. Kind of like a dog whistle. Why are we talking about? I mean, it's there. We're talking. Is she just a convenience black, right? Black when she wants to be and not when she's not. And this kind of says, yeah, she's another one of the DEI candidates that is taking opportunities from us whites and males. I mean, that was the wink, wink, wasn't it? That's and then he would deprecate her, saying, "Oh, she's not very intelligent." Kind of like those women. They they don't know what they're doing. It's like he would say, "She I can't imagine her with the tough guys like Putin. They're going to run all over her and so forth and so on." Kind of playing up the alpha male model. It's clear that the goal against Biden had been strength versus weakness. And that didn't change with Harris, but it changed not because she was old. It changed because she was a woman. And then you couple that with a kind of DEI thing, and she's undeserving. She's not qualified. She's just not got what it takes. So, it could be that for some people, that kind of messaging was sufficiently effective. There are 7 million people staying on the couch. Maybe some people said, yeah, I don't like Trump. I'm not going to vote for him. But that Harris, I don't know about her. She might be right on this, enough doubts because there was never a campaign that brought Harris to us. She was anointed. And I think he could throw those issues out there and cast doubt because she was not battle tested, right? She hadn't won any primaries. She hadn't done anything. She was just an appendage to Joe. And so I don't know. I mean, that's as much as I was happy to see, Joe leave. That was the relief theory. You still had to go and ask yourself, if this is a change election, is she sufficiently a change agent? And against a kind of toxic masculine alpha male figure like Trump, how is that going to be? And I think that getting shot in Butler was, kind of in a cruel and weird way, a big boost for him because it reinforced the macho male fight, that whole aspect of how he positioned himself, right? I mean, Elon Musk endorsed him after that. He was like exuberant about it, saying, man, this guy is a tough son of a gun. Again, it just contrasts that to the happy, full of joy Harris thing. It's just like, people weren't full of joy. They were a pretty miserable group, and they wanted a fighter of the type he was, kind of this masculine, genotype. And like I say, this is what we're trying to explain is at least the 7 million who dissipated, right? That's the problem. She would have won if those people had come out. So something kept them home. And could it have been this dimension? They couldn't vote for Trump, but they just couldn't bring themselves to vote for Harris either. Judy, unless somebody follow up, Ms. Howard.
Judy, you go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to lower my hand. Thank you very much. That was a really, really good presentation, and I'm hoping. Is that slide deck going to be available for us to?
I can send it to Bill, and
I would love to have that slide deck, especially the one on the state. Where you did this, looking at the state elected representatives, because I do a lot of work on that, and I think that I'm fascinated with a lot of the reasons about people staying home, and I think that that's probably maybe where we lost this election. And I absolutely agree with that conclusion that you made. But I think that one of the things that I'd love to kind of get your opinion on is you said, and I wrote it down, for whatever reason, people didn't remember how bad he was. And I thought to myself, there's an entire world of explanation in that I think we need to have in order to attract that. The economic numbers you show, what I read said that people that made between $30,000 and $70,000 a year voted for him. People who made under $30,000 a year voted for Harris, and over $70,000 a year voted for Trump. And that I could have some of those numbers a little off, but that seemed to go with what you presented. So I guess that my question is how is it that that middle doesn't see, or we're not seeing how to get to them to help them see how toxic he's going to be, especially with these tariffs, because the people on the high end are going to get through that. So I guess that's my question. How did
That's because they were retrospective voters. They were not prospective voters. It was a referendum, not a choice. I mean, I respond that way. That's an empty way of saying I don't know what more you could have done to say, look at his policies and ask yourself, how is this going to make you better off?
Yeah.
If because during the debate, right, he was his response was, we did tariffs in my first term and we didn't get inflation. And if people say to themselves, huh, he did tariffs and it was 7% cumulative before COVID, he must be right. There's a magic elixir. There's the red button. He's going to push it. And before you know it, we'll have inflation-free tariffs. And so, she would come back and say, I've got all these smart people saying that that's bullshit. And, there you go again. Those elites are they're conspiring against working class, that whole thing, right? And so it was just, my theory is you needed a guy like a pre-stroke Fetterman, somebody who kind of is big, rough, mean, and could, just have at that level of toxic masculinity. You could have just interchanged at that level, and somehow that might have connected. But the graceful lawyer that she was, and us educated people, we admire her, we listen to her, we try to figure out, where she's coming from and the logic of what she's saying. But, people will listen to Trump, and, he can just say crazy stuff like they eating the pets, your geese are in trouble, just crazy stuff. But if there's a predilection to believe that the borders are out of control, immigrants are taking your jobs, they're taking your housing, they're in your hospitals, they're in your schools, hey, they're in your parks, they're in fact eating up the stuff in your parks. At some point, you have created a mindset that overwhelms rational thought. It just goes beyond it. And if you're willing to lie and say very exaggerated things, you don't care what Glenn Kessler is going to say about you next day in the Post, or Steve Kornacki or any of these guys, right? They just don't care because, they've got an echo chamber, and this is like the media problem, right? And so this is a big deal and needs some thought. But, there's the echo chamber that focuses on just the things that they want to reinforce. And, I'm sure that in Fox, they didn't have any long discussions about what are terrorists and, or, One America or any of the other places, right? They just don't talk about it. They just talk about immigrants. They just fixate on one thing. And there's a kind of emotional ease to connecting with kind of people who are alien to you, who have just shown up, and, they're being shipped here and there. I mean, brilliant move by Abbott and his friends, right? And DeSantis shipping immigrants to New York City. And, this has caused that. What else can you use to explain the Republican shift there in New York? They were more clever than Democrats were. They were just more clever about it, right? They knew how to push the emotional heartstrings and to create tactics that were successful in reinforcing their core message. And so, you need reflection on this. What lessons have been learned? How are you going to approach this in the future? You can't assume anything graceful, moral, civil, truthful. You have to assume that they're going to come with every possible aspersion and insecurity. They're going to play on your insecurities. Now they're going to be the incumbents, right? So the good side of it is that now anything that they do, you could blame and say, well, all right, you promised this, you promised that, and what are his policies actually going to be, right? That's another, I don't know. I mean, deportation won't look nice, right? Then, news, not Fox, will report on deportations, the tearful parting, families being broken up, taken over to internment camps, people who never spent any time, kids never spent any time in Latin America, being told they need to learn how to speak Spanish because that's where they're going. At some point, the emotional heartstrings will shift a little bit to putting them more on the defensive. But to the extent that they can play the zero-sum mindset, right, where it's a good thing those people are leaving because now Americans take those shops back, take those houses back, don't have to pay for their welfare, for their emergency rooms, for, just a laundry list of things that the undeserving are getting. Because the Republicans have played the game of the undeserving forever. They're very good at it. I mean, this pre-Trump, right? Except now the undeserving are especially immigrants. And Nataf, Ukrainians, and not Israelis yet, right? They're still in the deserving camp. But just finding people who are undeserving and playing the zero-sum model has proven to be devastatingly successful. And that's where we are. Just need a way out. Eileen?
And that's where we are.
Okay.
I think probably I want to at this point, because it's 8:30 and we've been totally blown away by all you've shared with us. It's just really, it's overwhelming. It's fantastic. The amount of work you do to prepare something like this, Dan, greatly appreciate it. And your generosity in being willing to share it, that's great. And if you send it to me, I'll make it available.
Sure.
Want to thank you again. I want to convey to everybody, we have holidays coming up. Please stay connected and celebrate the holidays as best you can with the people that you love. And see you next time.